Now, my new rule is I do not want any old man or women outside the home except for my given time. Now, I want you all to leave from here and come out on my given time for a walk. I'm HOA Queen.
She decided residents were spending too much time outdoors, and that single rule exposed exactly how far HOA power actually goes. The neighborhood itself was about as normal as it gets. Quiet suburban streets, trimmed lawns, a couple looping walking paths, and a handful of benches scattered near the mailboxes and playground. People walked dogs in the evenings, kids rode bikes until sunset, retirees sat outside chatting. Nothing loud, nothing sketchy. It was the kind of place where being outside was basically the whole appeal. That changed one Tuesday morning when an HOA-wide email hit everyone's inbox. The subject line read Community Outdoor Use Guidelines, which already sounded off. Buried in the body was a brand new rule Karen had drafted and pushed through as a temporary measure. According to her, residents were spending excessive time outside their homes, creating loitering concerns and visual clutter. Her solution was a limit on how long anyone could remain outdoors in common areas near their homes. The guideline claimed residents shouldn't be outside their houses or using shared spaces for more than a set amount of time unless they were actively walking somewhere. Sitting, standing, or gathering beyond that window would be considered a violation. It wasn't a suggestion. It was written like enforcement was already planned. That was the first shift from casual HOA oversight to behavior control. People reread it thinking it had to be a joke. It wasn't. Karen signed the email with her board title and added that warnings would begin immediately while the board monitored compliance. The wording felt rushed, like she'd cooked it up on a power trip and hit send before anyone could stop her. Within minutes, group chats blew up. Neighbors asked each other if they were reading the same thing. Someone joked that sitting on your own porch was now illegal. Another asked how long too long even meant. The confusion turned into irritation fast. That was the second shift, from private confusion to collective pushback. By lunchtime, Karen doubled down by posting printed notices on the community bulletin board near the mailboxes. Same language, same limits, bolded phrases about loitering and enforcement. Seeing it on paper made it feel real, not just an email mistake. People walking past stopped and stared. A couple tore off photos with their phones. The rule had officially moved from inbox drama to physical space. Homeowners started asking the obvious question. Where did this rule even come from? The bylaws didn't mention outdoor time limits. The CC and RS didn't say anything about loitering in common areas owned by the city. That question mattered because it forced the issue out of opinion territory and into authority territory. Karen responded in the HOA portal comments, saying the board has discretion to regulate community behavior to maintain order and appearance. She didn't cite a section. She didn't link a rule. She just asserted it. That answer wasn't reassuring. It raised more red flags. A resident replied asking whether sidewalks were HOA property or city property. Karen didn't answer that directly. Instead, she repeated that residents were expected to comply while the board reviewed feedback. That dodge was another escalation. It signaled she either didn't know the boundary or didn't care. By that evening, people were testing the rule without meaning to. Neighbors stood talking on the path, checking their phones like they were waiting for a timer to go off. Someone joked that they felt like they were on probation. The vibe shifted from annoyance to disbelief. The idea that an HOA could limit how long you stand outside your own house felt insane, and everyone knew it. That's when the first formal challenge came in. A homeowner emailed the management company directly, asking for the legal basis of the guideline. Another copied city code enforcement, asking who actually controlled the sidewalks. The fight moved again, away from Karen's clipboard and into official channels where answers actually matter. Karen still thought she was setting boundaries. In reality, she'd kicked open a door she couldn't close. What started as a casual attempt to micromanage behavior had turned into a jurisdiction question with paper trails. Residents weren't just annoyed anymore. They were engaged. The rule didn't just limit outdoor time. It exposed how quickly HOA authority falls apart once people ask basic questions. And this was just the early warning phase. Karen had no idea yet how fast this was about to blow back on her, but the clock was already ticking and everyone could feel it. The first real challenge didn't come from a protest or a meeting, it came from a simple reply email that hit the HOA thread less than an hour after Karen's announcement. One resident asked, calmly and directly, which bylaw authorized the board to limit how long someone could be outside their own home. No sarcasm, no rant, just a request for the section number. That question shifted the entire situation from opinion to authority, and everyone watching knew it. Karen answered within minutes, which surprised people. She didn't cite anything specific. Instead, she said the board has the right to regulate community behavior, to preserve order and appearance. The phrasing was vague, almost copy-paste, and it didn't actually answer the question. That response mattered because it showed she was leaning on assumed power instead of written rules. You could practically feel trust wobble. Another homeowner jumped in right after, changing the angle completely. They pointed out that the sidewalks and walking paths Karen was talking about weren't HOA property at all. They were public rights-of-way owned and maintained by the city. That comment hit harder than the first one. It introduced jurisdiction, not just bylaws. Once public property enters the conversation, HOA authority gets real thin real fast. Karen brushed it off like it was a technicality. She replied that while the city owns the sidewalks, the HOA still oversees conduct within the community boundaries. She said enforcement would continue while the board reviewed feedback. That dismissal was a power move and a bad one. Instead of slowing down or clarifying, she doubled down. The escalation wasn't loud, but it was deliberate. At that point, the conversation spread beyond the email thread. Neighbors started talking face-to-face on the paths Karen wanted to regulate. People stood around longer than usual, almost daring someone to say something. Someone joked that they were timing themselves. Another said they felt like they were breaking curfew. Humor started creeping in, but underneath it was frustration. A third resident emailed the management company directly, forwarding Karen's responses and asking whether the HOA actually had authority over time spent outdoors. That moved the conflict again, away from Karen's control and into the hands of people who answer to contracts and law, not vibes. This wasn't gossip anymore. It was an inquiry. Karen noticed the shift and tried to reassert control. She posted a follow-up message reminding residents that failure to comply could result in warnings. The language was firmer now, more official sounding. That was another escalation from guideline to threat. She was betting people would back down once consequences were mentioned. Instead, the opposite happened. More residents started asking questions. Someone asked how long was too long. Another asked whether sitting on your porch counted. A parent asked if kids playing outside would be timed. Karen didn't answer those. She repeated that enforcement would proceed while details were finalized. That refusal to clarify made her position weaker by the minute. The public sidewalk issue came up again, this time louder. A homeowner quoted city code stating sidewalks are open for public use without time limits. Karen responded that HOA standards still applied to residents regardless of ownership. That line landed badly. Even people who didn't care about the rule before started paying attention. It sounded like she was making it up as she went. By the end of the day, the tone of the neighborhood had shifted. People weren't just annoyed. They were skeptical. The rule no longer felt like an overreach. Felt like a test. Karen was testing how far she could go without being checked, and residents were starting to push back instead of shrugging it off. That first challenge cracked the illusion that the rule was legitimate. The second challenge exposed the jurisdiction problem. Karen's insistence on enforcement despite unanswered questions escalated the situation from internal HOA drama to something that clearly needed outside clarification. She thought asserting authority would shut people up. Instead, it triggered scrutiny. Once homeowners start asking for bylaws and citing city property lines, the conversation changes permanently. You can't unring that bell. By insisting enforcement would proceed anyway, Karen locked herself into a position she couldn't easily walk back from. She'd been challenged twice in writing and chose to dismiss both concerns. That decision mattered more than the rule itself. It showed she wasn't interested in being right. She was interested in being in charge. And that's when residents stopped treating the rule like a mistake and started treating it like a problem that needed to be dealt with. Karen didn't wait for clarification or feedback. The very next morning, residents woke up to find printed notices taped to community benches, light poles, and the small signposts along the walking paths. Bright paper, bold text, impossible to miss. Each one repeated the same message about excessive outdoor presence, and referenced the new guideline like it had always existed. That physical posting was a shift in location and authority, taking the issue out of email threads and planting it directly into shared space. People stopped mid-walk to read them. Dog owners slowed down. Joggers pulled out earbuds. Seeing the rule in black and white made it feel more serious, even if it didn't make more sense. Karen had taken the next step from talking about enforcement to acting like enforcement was already underway. That move mattered because once notices go up, it signals intent, not discussion. Later that afternoon, Karen followed up with another message through the HOA portal. This time, she claimed extended outdoor presence created safety risks and nuisance concerns. She mentioned loitering, obstruction of paths, and vague worries about people lingering too long. None of it was backed by incidents or reports. It was all hypothetical, but it was framed like a problem already proven. That framing was deliberate. It turned normal behavior into a supposed issue. She went further and spelled out consequences. First-time violators would receive warnings. Repeat violators could face fines. The amounts weren't listed, but the threat was clear. That escalation from guideline to punishment changed the stakes. It wasn't about suggestions anymore. It was about control. People noticed the language had hardened and it didn't sit right. Residents started reacting in real time. Someone pulled down a notice and snapped a photo before putting it back. Another recorded Karen herself walking the path, clipboard in hand, checking benches. A couple of neighbors joked that they felt like they were being timed, but they still kept their phones ready. Documentation became the new instinct. When authority feels sketchy, people start collecting receipts. By evening, a shared folder popped up among a few residents. Photos of posted notices. Screenshots of portal messages. Timestamps. Locations. What started as annoyance turned into quiet coordination. That was another power shift. Karen wasn't the only one keeping records anymore. Karen noticed the attention and leaned into it instead of backing off. She replied to comments saying enforcement was necessary to restore order, and that cooperation would prevent escalation. That wording hit wrong. There hadn't been disorder to begin with. The claim sounded inflated, like she was justifying action after the fact. A neighbor replied asking what specific safety incidents prompted the rule. Karen didn't answer that question. She repeated that the board had discretion to act proactively. That dodge was telling. Every unanswered question chipped away at her credibility, and people could feel it. That night, more notices went up. Not replacements but additional ones. She'd expanded coverage, taping them closer to entrances and near the playground. That expansion escalated the situation again, widening the impact and increasing visibility. Parents noticed immediately. Kids playing outside suddenly felt like part of a violation. Residents started timing how long Karen herself stayed outside while posting notices. Someone joked that she'd already broken her own rule. The humor was light, but the point landed. If the guideline couldn't even be applied consistently, it was shaky at best. By the next morning, someone emailed the management company attaching photos of the notices and asking whether they were authorized. Another forwarded the same images to city code enforcement, asking who had jurisdiction over posted rules on public paths. The issue had officially moved beyond Karen's control. Karen still acted like she was running the show. She sent one more message warning that failure to comply could result in fines being added to accounts automatically. That sentence escalated things further. Automated penalties imply system backing, and she didn't have that authority. Residents didn't panic. They documented more. They shared more. They stopped arguing in the comments and started escalating upward. Silence replaced debate, which is never a good sign for someone overreaching. By posting notices and threatening fines, Karen thought she was asserting dominance. In reality, she created evidence. The benches and paths became exhibits. The rule she wanted enforced was now under a microscope. What she saw as doubling down was actually her digging in deeper. Every sign she taped up made it harder to claim misunderstanding later. The more visible the rule became, the more people questioned its legitimacy. The neighborhood hadn't erupted yet, but the tone had changed completely. This wasn't about outdoor time anymore. It was about whether one board member could invent limits and enforce them without backing. And now there were photos, witnesses, and a growing paper trail that said otherwise. The pushback finally reached someone with actual authority when multiple homeowners contacted the HOA management company directly. Not angry rants, not vague complaints, but clear emails asking one question. Where does the HOA get the power to regulate how long residents spend outdoors? That move shifted the entire situation out of Karen's hands. Instead of arguing with a board member, residents were now dealing with the professionals who manage compliance, contracts, and liability. The management company responded quicker than anyone expected. Within a day, they sent a written clarification stating plainly that the HOA does not have authority to regulate residents' time spent outdoors. They explained that behavior limits like that aren't covered under the governing documents and never had been. The wording was careful but firm. This wasn't a suggestion. It was a line in the sand. That response changed the power balance instantly. Karen's rule wasn't just unpopular anymore. It was officially unsupported. The management company copied the full board on the response, which made it impossible to quietly ignore. Residents forwarded the email to each other, and the tone in the neighborhood shifted from confusion to confidence. People knew where they stood now. Almost at the same time, another authority chimed in. City code enforcement replied to a separate inquiry about the walking paths and sidewalks. Their response was even more direct. The sidewalks were public right-of-way, owned and maintained by the city. The HOA had zero jurisdiction over posted rules, time limits, or conduct there beyond basic safety coordination. That confirmation closed the loop. HOA authority stopped at private common areas, and even there, time limits weren't enforceable. That double confirmation mattered. It wasn't just one opinion. It was management and the city agreeing. Jurisdiction had been clearly defined from two different angles. For most reasonable people, that would have been the end of it. Karen didn't see it that way. Instead of backing off, she dismissed the clarification as advisory. She claimed the management company was being overly cautious and that the board still had discretion to enforce community standards. She didn't deny the emails existed. She just ignored their substance. That choice escalated the situation again, this time into willful defiance. She left the posted notices up. She continued referencing fines and messages. She even added a note saying enforcement would continue, pending board review, as if that bought her time. It didn't. It just created proof that she'd been informed and chose to proceed anyway. Residents noticed the contradiction immediately. The same day management said the rule wasn't valid, Karen was still acting like it was. That disconnect was glaring. People started screenshotting both messages side by side. One said no authority. The other said enforcement would proceed. You didn't need a law degree to see the problem. A homeowner replied directly to Karen, attaching the management email and asking why enforcement was still happening. Karen didn't answer the question. She repeated that the board would review matters internally. That dodge didn't land. Silence would have been better. Her response made it clear she was stalling. At this point, the location of the conflict shifted again. It wasn't happening on benches or sidewalks anymore. It was happening in inboxes, portals, and documentation. Every action Karen took was now traceable against official guidance. The escalation wasn't loud, but it was serious. The management company followed up with another message, this one addressed to the board as a whole. They reiterated that enforcement of the outdoor time guidelines should stop immediately to avoid liability. That email wasn't sent lightly. Management companies don't like telling boards to halt actions unless there's real risk involved. Karen replied anyway, arguing that residents were overreacting and that the guideline was being misunderstood. That response crossed another line. She wasn't just ignoring homeowners now. She was brushing off professional guidance from the company hired to keep the HOA out of trouble. That decision sealed it. Once a board member knowingly ignores both management and city clarification, it stops being a misunderstanding and becomes an overreach. The power had fully shifted away from Karen, even if she refused to accept it. Residents didn't need to argue anymore. The facts were documented. The boundaries were defined. Karen continuing enforcement didn't make her stronger. It made her exposed. The irony was thick. The rule was supposed to reduce nuisance behavior. Instead, it created the biggest mess the HOA had seen in years. And now, with authority clearly defined and ignored, the next step wasn't debate. It was intervention. Karen thought she could outlast the pushback by sheer confidence. What she didn't realize was that once jurisdiction is spelled out in writing, ignoring it only speeds up consequences. The line had been drawn clearly. She stepped over it anyway. Karen crossed the line the moment she started acting like a hall monitor instead of a board member. Late that afternoon, she walked the main path with her phone out, stopwatch running, eyes locked on anyone sitting longer than she liked. She wasn't subtle. She stood a few feet away from two neighbors chatting on a bench, arms crossed, timing them like they were on some twisted game show. That physical presence changed everything. This wasn't policy talk anymore. It was direct confrontation. After a few minutes, she cleared her throat loudly and announced they'd exceeded the acceptable outdoor duration. She said it like it was official, like there was a clock somewhere everyone else had missed. One neighbor laughed, thinking it was sarcasm. Karen didn't laugh back. She pulled out a printed warning form and started writing names. That was the next escalation, moving from observation to enforcement in real time. She told them the warning was for excessive outdoor activity and that further violations would result in fines. The language was stiff, overly formal, and honestly ridiculous given the setting. Kids were riding bikes nearby. Someone was grilling down the street. The contrast made her look completely out of touch. Still, she kept going, pen scratching like she was documenting a crime. One of the residents stood up and calmly refused to accept the paper. He said the bench sat on a public right-of-way and that city law allowed anyone to sit there without time limits. He wasn't loud or angry. He just stated it plainly. That response mattered. It wasn't emotional pushback. It was legal grounding. Karen snapped back that HOA standards still applied within community boundaries. She said residents couldn't hide behind technicalities. That word choice landed badly. People nearby stopped pretending not to listen. Phones came out, discreetly but clearly. Someone whispered that this was getting wild. The situation had officially gone public. The resident repeated that public right-of-way laws override HOA guidelines and that she didn't have authority to issue warnings there. Karen didn't respond to the law. She responded with a threat. She said she'd escalate the matter to the full board and that formal action would follow. That threat was the tipping point. She wasn't enforcing rules anymore. She was flexing power. Another neighbor asked her to leave them alone. Karen refused, saying compliance was mandatory. She glanced at her phone again like she was adding time to some invisible ledger. That behavior felt invasive and people reacted accordingly. Someone called out that she was harassing residents. Karen ignored it and kept writing. At that moment the dynamic flipped. Residents weren't just annoyed. They were unified. One person started filming openly. Another asked Karen to identify which bylaw allowed timing people outside. She didn't answer. She stuffed the warning form back into her folder and said the board would handle it later. That retreat wasn't strategic. It was defensive. Karen walked farther down the path, repeating the same routine with another group. She timed, she warned, she threatened. Each interaction escalated the situation further. By now, multiple people were recording. Not yelling, not interfering, just documenting. That shift was huge. Once documentation starts, authority figures lose the ability to spin the story later. A resident finally told her that if she didn't stop harassing people on public property, they'd contact the city directly. Karen laughed it off and said she welcomed the review. That confidence was misplaced, but she didn't know it yet. She thought threats worked both ways. Within an hour, screenshots of her warnings and videos of her timing people circulated through neighborhood chats. The tone wasn't angry. It was incredulous. People couldn't believe she'd gone that far after management had already clarified limits. The line crossing wasn't subtle. It was blatant. Karen sent one more message that evening saying formal board action would address non-compliance. That sentence sealed it. She'd confronted residents, attempted enforcement on public land, ignored legal objections and doubled down with threats. Each step built on the last and none of it could be undone. What she saw as standing her ground looked a lot like harassment to everyone else. The power she thought she had evaporated the moment residents stood their ground calmly and cited actual law. Timing people outside didn't make her look authoritative. It made her look unhinged. By the end of the night, it was clear something bigger was coming. Karen had crossed from overreach into liability, and she'd done it in front of witnesses. The board hadn't intervened yet, but the stage was set. Once someone starts threatening formal action without jurisdiction, the consequences don't stay theoretical for long. The situation jumped levels the moment the management company stopped treating it like a resident complaint and flagged it as a board-level issue. By the next morning, the entire HOA board received a formal escalation memo outlining Karen's actions, the resident documentation, and the direct conflict with both management guidance and city jurisdiction. That shift mattered. The issue was no longer about one rule. It was about exposure. An emergency board meeting was scheduled for that evening, not the usual monthly sit-down. Virtual, cameras on, attendance mandatory. The management company opened by summarizing the timeline. The guideline announcement, resident challenges, posted notices, confrontations on public paths, and the refusal to halt enforcement after clarification. They didn't editorialize. They just laid it out clean, which somehow made it hit harder. Karen didn't wait long to jump in. She argued the rule was necessary to prevent loitering and maintain order. She framed herself as proactive, saying the board needed to act before things got worse. Her tone was defensive but confident, like she expected backup. Instead, she got silence. That pause was a power shift all by itself. The management rep reminded the board that necessity doesn't create authority. They reiterated that regulating time spent outdoors wasn't supported by the governing documents. They also pointed out that enforcement on public rights-of-way could invite city involvement. That wasn't speculation. That was risk assessment. You could feel the mood change as board members started asking fewer questions and taking more notes. Karen refused to retract the rule. She said pulling it would make the board look weak and that residents were already pushing boundaries. She insisted the guideline sent the right message. That stance escalated things further. At that point, it wasn't about the rule anymore. It was about her unwillingness to course-correct when shown she was wrong. That's when legal counsel entered the conversation. The HOA's attorney joined the call briefly, and the tone shifted again. Lawyers don't get brought in for vibes. He explained that continuing enforcement after receiving clear guidance created liability. Harassment claims, selective enforcement, potential civil exposure. None of it sounded dramatic, but it all sounded expensive. He specifically warned that timing residents and issuing warnings on public property could be construed as overreach. He added that ignoring management advice weakened any defense. The board didn't interrupt him. Karen did. She argued that backing down would invite chaos and that residents needed discipline. That comment didn't land the way she thought it would. The attorney responded calmly, saying discipline without authority is a problem, not a solution. He recommended immediate suspension of the guideline and cessation of enforcement. That recommendation wasn't framed as optional. It was risk mitigation. The board members nodded. Karen crossed her arms. She pushed back hard, saying the board should stand firm and not cave to pressure. She accused residents of exaggerating and said the documentation was being weaponized against her. That framing raised eyebrows. It sounded less like leadership and more like deflection. The room felt tense, not because people were angry but because the disconnect was obvious. A board member finally spoke up and asked Karen directly whether she would comply with legal counsel's recommendation. She didn't answer right away. When she did, she said she believed the rule was still valid and that enforcement should continue pending further review. That answer landed like a thud. At that moment, the escalation became unavoidable. Karen wasn't just advocating a rule. She was challenging the board's legal guidance. The management company noted that continued enforcement could force them to formally intervene. That's corporate speak for, this is getting serious. The meeting ended without a vote, but the direction was clear. The board needed time to act, and Karen had made her position crystal. She wasn't backing down. That refusal changed the stakes entirely. What could have been resolved quietly now required decisive action. Within hours, residents noticed enforcement activity stop, not because Karen agreed, but because management instructed staff to pause everything. That interim freeze was another shift. Authority had moved above her, even if she didn't accept it yet. Karen thought standing firm showed strength. In reality, it isolated her. The board wasn't impressed by stubbornness when lawyers were warning about liability. The escalation had reached the point where personalities no longer mattered. Process did. By refusing to retract the rule after legal warnings, Karen forced the board's hand. The issue was no longer whether the guideline made sense. It was whether the HOA could afford to let one person keep pushing it. And once liability enters the chat, confidence stops being a shield and starts being a risk. The intervention finally came in writing, and it wasn't subtle. The HOA attorney sent Karen a formal directive instructing her to stop all enforcement related to the outdoor time rule immediately. No soft language, no consider this, just a clear order citing liability concerns and lack of authority. That email also went to the full board and the management company, which mattered. It wasn't a private suggestion anymore. It was an official stop sign. For most people, that would have been the end of it. Karen wasn't most people. Instead of backing off, she ignored the directive entirely. Less than 24 hours later, residents woke up to another HOA email from her. This one warned that continued non-compliance would be addressed formally, and reminded everyone that the board expected cooperation. She didn't mention the attorney. She didn't acknowledge the instruction. She just acted like it never happened. That move changed everything. Ignoring legal counsel isn't confidence, it's defiance. Residents immediately noticed. Screenshots of the attorney's email and Karen's new warning started circulating side by side. The contrast was wild. One said stop. The other said enforcement continued. You didn't need insider knowledge to see the problem. Management escalated again, this time requesting an emergency board session. Not the regular calendar meeting. An unscheduled one within days. That alone signaled how serious it had gotten. Emergency sessions cost money and time, and boards don't call them unless something's on fire. This wasn't about outdoor benches anymore. It was about whether a board member could openly disregard legal instruction. When the session convened, the tone was completely different from before. Cameras on. Notes taken. The attorney joined again, reiterating that Karen's latest email made the HOA more exposed, not less. He explained that continued enforcement after a direct stop order could be seen as willful misconduct. That phrase landed heavy. Willful isn't a good look when lawyers are talking. Karen defended herself by saying residents needed structure and that backing down would undermine authority. She framed herself as the only one willing to do the hard stuff. That argument didn't play well this time. The board wasn't debating philosophy anymore. They were dealing with risk management. A board member asked Karen why she sent the warning email after being told to stop. She said she believed the attorney was being overly cautious. That answer sucked the air out of the call. It wasn't just disagreement. It was dismissal. You could see board members exchange looks on camera. That was the moment things tipped. The attorney spoke again, calmly explaining that ignoring legal advice removed protections for both the HOA and individual board members. He didn't threaten. He informed. The implication was clear. Keep going and you're on your own. That clarification shifted power instantly. Karen wasn't just endangering the HOA anymore. She was endangering herself. The board went into closed discussion briefly. When they came back, the decision was quick. Karen was removed from all enforcement authority effective immediately, pending formal review. She could retain her board seat for now, but she was barred from issuing warnings, posting notices, or contacting residents about compliance. That separation mattered. It stripped her of the tools she'd been abusing. Karen objected loudly, saying the board was caving. The chair shut that down and said the decision was final. No debate. No vote reconsideration. The escalation ladder had reached the top, and authority had finally intervened. Residents found out the same day through a short announcement stating enforcement activities were suspended and that prior warnings related to outdoor time were void. No drama. Just clarity. The rule was effectively dead. Karen went quiet after that. No more emails. No more notices. The silence was jarring given how loud she'd been before. That quiet wasn't voluntary. It was enforced. The shift was immediate. People sat outside again without checking the clock. Kids played. Benches filled. The neighborhood exhaled. Everyone knew what had happened even if it wasn't spelled out. By ignoring a direct legal order, Karen forced the board to act decisively. What could have ended with a retraction ended with her losing authority. That's the thing about power plays. If you push past the last warning, the response stops being polite. This wasn't a punishment out of spite. It was containment. The board had to stop the bleeding and Karen was the source. Once legal counsel steps in and gets ignored, the window for compromise slams shut. Karen thought standing firm would prove strength. Instead, it proved she couldn't be trusted with enforcement power. And once that trust is gone, it doesn't come back easily. The official correction landed 2 days later, and the tone alone told everyone the fight was over. A community-wide email went out from the HOA board, not Karen, not management, but the board itself. The subject line was blunt and boring, which honestly made it hit harder. Inside, the message stated clearly that the previously announced outdoor time guideline was void and had no effect. No spin. No conditions. Just cancelled. That email shifted the power one last time. It took the issue out of rumor territory and locked the outcome in writing. The board explained that residents were free to use common areas, sidewalks, and spaces near their homes without time restrictions. That single sentence undid weeks of stress. People reread it just to be sure. Screenshots flew through group chats like receipts after a win. The board didn't stop there. They explicitly stated that no outdoor time limits existed now or in the past under HOA rules. That clarification mattered. It wasn't just, we changed our mind. It was, this was never valid. That distinction protected residents from future nonsense and quietly undercut Karen's entire argument. A few lines later came the cleanup. The email confirmed that all warnings issued under the invalid guideline were formally rescinded. Accounts would show no record. No fines. No notes. Nothing lingering. That move was huge. It erased consequences instead of just pausing them. For residents who'd been worried about paper trails, that was the real relief. The board included an apology, careful and corporate, saying they regretted the confusion caused by the situation. No names were mentioned. No fingers pointed. Everyone knew who it was about anyway. The lack of a name wasn't protection. It was containment. The board was done letting one person's overreach define the HOA. Almost immediately, the neighborhood vibe changed. People went back outside like they'd been holding their breath for weeks. Benches filled up. Parents lingered while kids played. Dog walkers slowed down to chat. The difference was noticeable. Not loud, not dramatic, just normal again. Sometimes normal is the loudest statement you can make. Neighbors talked about the email openly. Someone joked that the HOA finally remembered sidewalks exist. Another said they were glad the board stepped in before things got even dumber. The humor wasn't mean. It was relieved. Everyone felt like a line had been redrawn where it should have been all along. Karen didn't respond publicly. No follow-up email. No explanation. No attempt to reframe. That silence was intentional and it spoke volumes. When someone who's been flooding inboxes suddenly goes quiet, it usually means the answer was no and it wasn't negotiable. Behind the scenes, the board removed the posted notices the same day. Maintenance took them down quietly, no fanfare. A couple residents snapped photos of the bare bulletin boards just in case. Old habits die hard after a mess like that. Still, seeing the paper gone felt like closure. The management company followed up with a short confirmation stating enforcement activities had ceased and normal operations resumed. That was procedural, but it mattered. It meant the fix wasn't just emotional. It was operational. Systems were reset. Within a week, the whole thing felt like a bad idea that never should have made it past draft. New residents wouldn't even know it happened unless someone told them. That's how effective resolutions work. They don't drag on. They end clean. The board's apology wasn't dramatic, but it did what it needed to do. It acknowledged the issue, corrected the mistake, and moved forward. No defensive language. No excuses. Just a reset. That approach restored more trust than arguing ever could. People still talked about it, but the tone had changed. It wasn't anger anymore. It was disbelief mixed with humor. Remember when we almost had outdoor curfews? Became a punchline, not a complaint. That shift meant the damage had stopped spreading. By formally voiding the rule and wiping out the warnings, the board closed every loose end Karen had created. There was nothing left for her to enforce, argue, or defend. The rule was dead, buried, and documented as such. The aftermath wasn't explosive. It was quiet, practical, and effective. Residents got their space back. The HOA got its footing back. And the lesson stuck without needing to be shouted. Authority only works when it stays in its lane. The consequences didn't stop once the rule was killed and the notices came down. A week later, the HOA board made another move, this one quieter but heavier. Karen was officially reassigned away from all resident-facing roles. No more enforcement. No more compliance emails. No more just checking in conversations on sidewalks. Her access to residents was cut off clean, and that change shifted the balance of power for good. The board didn't frame it as punishment, at least not publicly. Internally, though, the reasoning was blunt. They cited her repeated overreach, her confrontations with residents, and her refusal to follow legal guidance when it was clearly given. This wasn't about one bad idea anymore. It was about a pattern. Once that language entered the record, the situation stopped being reversible. The management company played a big role in this step. After reviewing the entire mess, they formally recommended a permanent role change for Karen. Their assessment was simple. She couldn't be trusted in positions that involved direct interaction with homeowners or enforcement authority. That recommendation carried weight. Management companies don't make suggestions like that lightly because they're the ones who deal with fallout when boards screw up. The board followed the recommendation without much debate. Karen was reassigned to an internal, non-enforcement role with limited scope and no independent authority. She could attend meetings, review documents, and offer input when asked, but she no longer had power to act unilaterally. That structural change mattered more than any apology ever could. Karen didn't take it well, but there was nothing she could do about it. The decision wasn't framed as temporary. It was positioned as necessary for the HOA's stability. That wording shut the door on appeals. Once something is labeled a risk management move, ego doesn't factor in anymore. Her influence within the HOA collapsed almost overnight. Board members who used to defer to her stopped backing her ideas. When she spoke in meetings, people listened politely, then moved on. Proposals she supported suddenly needed extra review. That kind of shift is brutal because it's subtle. No one calls it out, but everyone feels it. Residents noticed too. The emails stopped. The confrontations ended. Karen's presence faded from daily life, and that absence was noticeable. People realized how much tension she'd been injecting into the neighborhood until it disappeared. The relief wasn't loud, but it was real. Behind the scenes, the board documented everything. The overreach. The ignored legal advice. The escalation after clear warnings. That documentation locked in the role change. Even if Karen wanted to argue later, the record was there. Receipts matter, and this situation had plenty. The management company adjusted workflows to make sure no single board member could issue rules or warnings without oversight going forward. That operational tweak was another consequence of Karen's behavior. Her actions didn't just affect her position. They reshaped how the HOA functioned. Karen's reputation took the biggest hit. Inside the HOA, she went from being seen as decisive to being viewed as reckless. Outside, among residents, she became a cautionary tale. People talked about her less with anger and more with disbelief. That's not respect. That's fallout. At community events, she kept to herself. Conversations stopped when she approached. Not out of fear but awkwardness. Influence is built on trust, and once trust is gone, confidence just looks like noise. Karen still had opinions, but they didn't move anything anymore. The board never announced her reassignment publicly, but word spread anyway. These things always do. When someone stops wielding power, people notice the vacuum. And in this case, nobody rushed to fill it the way she had. What stung most was that none of this required yelling, votes of no confidence, or dramatic exits. It was administrative, procedural, final. That's how authority really strips power, when someone proves they can't handle it. Karen thought doubling down would force the board to support her. Instead, it isolated her. The refusal to follow legal guidance didn't make her look strong. It made her look like a liability. Once that label sticks, influence evaporates fast. By the end of the month, Karen was still technically on the board, but she wasn't driving anything. Her ideas stalled. Her reach was gone. The HOA moved forward without her steering it, and things ran smoother because of it. That was the real consequence beyond the neighborhood rule itself. One bad power grab didn't just get reversed. It permanently changed who was trusted to lead. And once authority collapses at that level, there's no easy way back. The final shift didn't come with another email blast or a heated meeting. It arrived quietly through administrative channels, the kind of move that tells you the decision is settled. Karen was transferred to a different HOA under the same management umbrella, one without shared lawns, benches, or walking paths. A desert-style development with minimal common space. No porches to police. No sidewalks to patrol. That relocation wasn't framed as punishment, but everyone understood the message. The transfer changed the power map instantly. Karen no longer had access to this neighborhood's residents, meetings, or systems. Her login privileges were updated. Her name disappeared from distribution lists. That separation mattered more than any confrontation could. Authority only works where access exists, and hers was gone. Back home, residents felt the difference almost immediately. People sat outside again without glancing at their phones. Parents lingered while kids played. Evening walks stretched longer. Chairs reappeared on porches. The neighborhood rhythm returned to what it had been before the mess. No warnings. No timers. Just normal life doing its thing. The absence of interference made everyone realize how intrusive it had been. Without someone hovering, the space felt lighter. Conversations lasted longer. Strangers waved again. The whole vibe reset. Sometimes you don't notice pressure until it's lifted. The HOA didn't just move Karen and call it a day. They updated governance policies to close the loophole she'd exploited. New language required board votes for any behavioral guidelines. Enforcement actions now needed management approval. Anything affecting resident conduct had to cite specific bylaw authority. Those changes weren't flashy, but they were solid. Training followed shortly after. Board members received a refresher on jurisdiction limits, public versus private property, and escalation protocols. It was boring on paper, but it mattered. Process replaced improvisation. Confidence was no longer a substitute for permission. Residents were notified of the updates in a brief, neutral announcement. No backstory. No drama. Just a summary of policy improvements. People appreciated that. It signaled the HOA had learned something without reopening old wounds. The situation was done. Karen didn't resurface. No goodbye message. No last word. She moved on to a place where outdoor oversight wasn't even possible. That outcome felt poetic without being cruel. Put someone who micromanages outside behavior into a setting where there's nothing to manage. Problem solved. The story became shorthand around the block. Someone would joke about, "That time we almost had an outdoor curfew," and everyone would chuckle. Another would say HOA rules expire at the property line. The humor stuck because it was grounded in reality. It wasn't exaggerated. It actually happened. What lingered most was the lesson. Authority has edges. It's defined by documents, property lines, and law, not by who speaks loudest. When those edges get ignored, systems push back. Not with yelling, but with process. Residents didn't become anti-HOA overnight. They became informed. Questions got sharper. Requests for citations became normal. That's healthy. Transparency beats fear every time. In the end, the neighborhood kept its sidewalks, its benches, and its freedom to exist outdoors. The HOA kept its structure, now tighter and clearer. Karen lost her platform not through outrage but through procedure. That's how real accountability looks. The final takeaway landed clean and simple. HOA authority ends where basic rights begin. You can't regulate people out of fresh air. You can't time normal life. And you definitely can't invent power where none exists. Once everyone understands that, the noise fades and normalcy wins. Looking back, the outcome felt earned, not lucky. The system corrected itself because people asked questions and held lines. No heroes, no villains, just boundaries enforced. That's the kind of ending viewers trust. It feels real, grounded, and repeatable, which is why the lesson sticks long after the story fades.
Alright, now I want to hear from you. Do you think she was completely out of the line here? Or do you believe authority sometimes goes too far? Drop your take in comments, I read every single one.